James sat at the bar, staring into the amber liquid swirling in his glass. The dim lighting cast long shadows over the polished wood, and the quiet hum of conversation buzzed around him like white noise. He barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, buried under the weight of exhaustion, disappointment, and something far heavier than he could name. He lifted the glass and took a slow sip, feeling the burn slide down his throat. It wasn't his first drink of the night, probably not his last either. He had never been much of a drinker before, but lately, the glass felt like the only thing keeping him from unraveling completely. The bartender walked past, wiping down the counter. He glanced at James, as if debating whether to say something, but thought better of it and moved on. James didn't blame him. What could he say? Rough day? You okay? The answers to those questions were too complicated, too exhausting to explain. Instead, James just sighed, running a hand through his hair. Work had been a disaster. Again, another missed deadline, another disappointed boss, another reminder that he wasn't the man he used to be. He used to be sharp, driven, unstoppable. Now he felt like he was just barely keeping his head above water. And then there was Emily, the fight from this morning, still echoed in his head. He could see the hurt in her eyes as she tried to reach him, tried to make him talk. But he didn't have the words. Or maybe he did, but he was too afraid of what they would mean if he said them out loud. I feel lost. Emily, I don't know who I am anymore. I'm scared that I'll never be the man you married again. But instead of saying any of that, he had just shut down, like always. And now, here he was, drowning himself in whiskey instead of facing the wreckage of his own making. The ice clinked against the glass as he took another sip. The warmth of the alcohol did little to fill the emptiness inside him. A group of friends laughed at a nearby table, their joy a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside his chest. He envied them. When was the last time he had laughed like that? When was the last time he had even felt like himself? The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, but James wasn't ready to go home yet, because home didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like another place where he was failing, another place where he didn't belong. Still, the alcohol was starting to catch up with him, and he knew he couldn't sit here forever. He fished out some cash, dropping it on the counter, and pushed himself up from the bar stool. His legs wobbled slightly beneath him, and he had to steady himself against the counter. The bartender gave him a knowing look. "You good, man?" James forced a tight-lipped smile and nodded. "Yeah, just tired." That wasn't a lie, he was tired. Bone-deep, soul-weary tired. Stepping outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. He took a deep breath, hoping it would clear his head, but the fog inside him refused to lift. The walk home wasn't long, but tonight it felt like an eternity. The quiet streets stretched before him, empty and endless. His feet dragged, his body moving on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Emily, of the way she had looked at him this morning, pleading, desperate, of the words she had whispered as he walked away. "I can't keep doing this, James." A lump formed in his throat. He knew she meant it. He knew he was pushing her away. But how was he supposed to let her in when he didn't even know where he was anymore? The lights of their house came into view, a warm glow against the darkness. For a moment, James hesitated. He could turn around, walk the other way, disappear into the night. Would she even notice? Would she even care? Shaking his head, he pushed the thought away and forced himself forward. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around him. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because the moment he crossed that threshold, he knew he couldn't keep drowning forever, and yet he didn't know how to swim back to the surface. The front door clicked shut behind James, the soft sound echoing in the quiet house. The warmth of home should have been comforting, but tonight it felt suffocating. His steps were heavy as he walked through the dimly lit hallway, each one dragging the weight of his exhaustion and guilt. And then he saw her. Emily stood at the base of the staircase, wrapped in her robe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her hair was slightly messy, like she'd been waiting up for him longer than she wanted to admit. Her eyes, those same warm eyes he had fallen in love with, were filled with something that made his chest tighten. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She just looked tired, and that was worse. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Hey," he mumbled, trying to sound normal, trying to pretend like he wasn't standing there, reeking of whiskey and regret. Emily didn't move. She just studied him for a long moment before letting out a small sigh. "You've been drinking again." It wasn't a question. He didn't bother lying. "Yeah." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected the answer, as if she had already prepared herself for it. "You didn't answer my texts," she said, her voice controlled, but laced with something fragile. "I was worried." James exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. He didn't know what to say, that he had ignored them on purpose, that he had seen them, each one a silent plea, but hadn't had the strength to reply. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and he meant it. But even to his own ears, the words felt empty. Emily didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, like he was a fragile thing that might break under too much pressure. "James, talk to me." There it was again. That plea. Soft, full of patience, but edged with quiet desperation. He wanted to, God, he wanted to. But where would he even start? How could he put into words the storm raging inside him, the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the fear that he was slipping further and further away from the man he used to be? Instead of answering, he looked away. Emily let out another sigh, this one heavier, weighted with unspoken things. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I miss you, James." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He closed, his eyes for a brief second, trying to swallow past the lump in his throat. He wanted to tell her that he missed her, too, that he missed himself. But the words wouldn't come, so he just stood there, silent. Emily waited. Maybe she hoped he would finally break, finally let her in, but when the silence stretched too long, she nodded to herself, as if accepting something she had been dreading. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. She turned then, heading up the stairs, her footsteps soft but deliberate. James wanted to stop her, to reach for her hand, to say something, anything that would make this right. But he didn't. He just stood there, drowning in the fog of his own making as she disappeared into the dark, and for the first time, the silence felt unbearable. The morning light crept through the blinds, casting soft golden streaks across the bedroom. James groaned as he turned onto his side, the dull pounding in his head a reminder of the night before. His throat was dry, his body heavy, but none of that compared to the weight pressing on his chest. Emily's side of the bed was empty. Not that he expected her to be there. James sat up slowly, running a hand over his face. He knew he had hurt her last night, not with harsh words or anger, but with silence. The kind that built walls, the kind that made love feel distant. He forced himself out of bed and padded down the hallway. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could pretend everything was fine. But when he reached the kitchen, Emily wasn't at the table like she usually was. Instead, she stood by the sink, staring out the window, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She didn't turn when he walked in. "Morning?" he said hesitantly. "Morning," she replied, but her voice was distant, careful. James hesitated before stepping closer. "Did you sleep okay?" She took a sip of her coffee before answering. "Not really," he swallowed. Finally, she turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. "James," she said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "With me?" His stomach tightened. "Okay." She set her cup down on the counter, folding her arms as if bracing herself. "Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. He expected anger, frustration, maybe even accusations, but not this. Was he happy? James exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to the floor. "I don't know." Emily nodded, as if she already knew the answer. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, the words coming out rough, unfiltered. "I feel like I'm failing, at work, at being a husband, at everything." Emily's face softened, and for the first time in weeks, she stepped toward him, reaching for his hand. Her fingers laced through his, warm and steady. "You're not failing," she whispered. "You're struggling. And I see you, James. I see how hard you're trying even when you think you're not." James felt his throat tighten. He had spent so long pretending he had everything under control, but here, in this moment, with Emily's hand in his, the walls he had built began to crack. "You don't have to do this alone," she continued. "Let me in, let me help." His instinct was to pull away, to retreat back into the silence he knew so well. But Emily's unwavering gaze held him in place, grounding him in a way nothing else could. For the first time in a long time, James allowed himself to lean into the love that had never wavered, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward finding his way back. The day dragged on with a heavy stillness. James sat in his office at work, his hands clasped together, staring blankly at the screen in front of him. His mind wasn't here. It was still back at home, replaying Emily's words over and over. "Ah, you happy?" He hadn't been able to answer her. Not properly, because the truth was, he didn't know what happiness even felt like anymore. A sharp knock on his door jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see his colleague Marcus standing in the doorway, concern etched across his face. "Hey man," Marcus said. "You good? You've been zoning out all morning." James forced a tired smile. "Yeah, just a rough night." Marcus studied him for a moment before stepping inside. "Look, I'm not trying to pry, but I've been where you are. You're not yourself, James. Something's eating at you." James exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "It's just life. It's a lot right now." Marcus nodded knowingly. "And Emily?" At the mention of her name, James felt his chest tighten. She's trying. And I know she loves me. I just don't know if I deserve it." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "You ever stop to think that maybe you don't have to deserve love? That maybe she's there because she sees something in you that you can't see? In yourself?" James looked away. "Look," Marcus continued, "I'm not saying it's easy, but shutting her out won't fix anything. You've got to start breaking those walls, man. Before they bury you." James sighed, rubbing his face. "I wouldn't even know where to start." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then start small. Talk to her. Let her in, even if it's just a little. She's already there, James. You just have to meet her halfway." That night, James sat on the couch, staring at the untouched glass of water in his hands. Emily was in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine, but he knew she wasn't really reading it. He could feel the space between them, like an invisible wall neither of them wanted, but didn't know how to break. He took a deep breath. "Em?" She looked up, surprised. "Yeah?" James hesitated for only a second before he pushed forward. "Can we talk?" A flicker of hope crossed her face. She set the magazine down and walked over, sitting beside him. "Of course," he swallowed. His hands felt clammy, his heart raced, but he forced the words out anyway. "I'm scared, Em. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm losing myself. And I don't know how to fix it." She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached for his hand, just like she had that morning. That simple gesture sent warmth through him, grounding him in a way nothing else had. "You don't have to. Fix it alone, James," she said softly. "I'm here. I've always been here," he nodded, squeezing her hand. "I know. And I don't want to keep pushing you away. I don't know how to let go of all this weight I'm carrying." Emily leaned in closer. "Then let's carry it together." For the first time in what felt like forever, James let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight this battle alone. The house was quieter than usual. The only sound came from the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. James sat at the dining table, staring at his untouched dinner, while Emily sat across from him, her fork slowly moving the food around her. Plate, they had been here before. Silent, distant, both pretending the tension wasn't as thick as it really was. But tonight, the air was different. James had finally taken the first step last night, breaking through the wall he had built between them. And now he could feel something shifting. Emily cleared her throat. "Did you get some rest today?" she asked gently. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not really. Work was a lot." Emily nodded, studying him carefully. "James, last night, when you said you felt like you were losing yourself," she paused, her voice soft. "I felt that way too." "About us?" James looked up sharply, his chest tightening. "You have?" She nodded, setting her fork down. "I miss you, James. I miss the way we used to talk, the way we used to laugh. Lately it feels like we've been living in the same house, but miles apart." James swallowed hard. "I know, and I hate that I've let it get this far." Emily reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Then let's talk, really talk. No more avoiding it." James hesitated. The words were there, waiting. But saying them out loud meant facing them. Still, he knew this moment was important. If he wanted to save what was left of their marriage, he had to be honest. He took a shaky breath. "I've been drowning, in work, in stress, in my own head. And instead of reaching for you, I kept pushing you away." His voice cracked slightly. "I was scared that if I let you see how lost I felt, you'd stop believing in me." Emily's eyes glistened. "James, I have never stopped believing in you. But I need you to believe in us again too." His throat tightened. He felt raw, exposed, but there was something freeing about saying the words out loud. "I want to," he admitted. "I don't want to keep shutting you out." Emily squeezed his hand. "Then don't." Silence filled the space between them, but it was no longer suffocating. It was filled with something else. Understanding, love, hope. For the first time in a long time, James felt like they were on the same page again. A moment of truth had passed between them, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. The morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts still lingering on the conversation from the night before. It had been the most honest he had been with Emily in a long time. And yet, the weight of everything wasn't gone. Emily stirred beside him, her breathing slow and steady. He turned his head slightly, watching her for a moment. She looked peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wished he could feel the same. Carefully, he slipped out of bed, making his way downstairs. He needed coffee, something to clear the fog in his mind. But as he stood by the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to brew, he realized what he really needed. Change. A real, tangible change. For months, he had drowned himself in work, in alcohol, in isolation. Now, the only way forward was to take a step, no matter how small, toward healing. The soft sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Emily stood in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, her eyes still filled with sleep. "You're up early," she said, rubbing her arms. James nodded. "I couldn't sleep much." She walked closer, leaning against the counter. Thinking about last night? He gave her a small smile. Yeah, it's been a long time since we talked like that. Emily reached for the coffee mug he poured and took a sip. It meant a lot to me, James, but I know words aren't enough. I want to see you try. Her words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. And James knew she was right. I know, he said, exhaling. I don't want to just say the right things. I want to do something. Emily set the mug down, her gaze soft but searching. Then what's the first step? The question sat between them, waiting for an answer. James looked down at his hands. I don't know, he admitted, but I do know I can't keep doing things the way I have been. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. Maybe start small. No drinking after work. No drowning yourself in late hours at the office. Maybe just be present. James ran a hand through his hair. That sounds so simple, but I feel like I've forgotten how to do that. Emily smiled slightly. Then let me remind you. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It was a small gesture, but it grounded him. Let's take it one step at a time, she said. We don't have to fix everything overnight. But if you're willing to try, I'm willing to meet you halfway. James swallowed the lump in his throat. He had been afraid for so long, afraid of failing, of not being enough. But in this moment, with Emily standing beside him, offering her unwavering support, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. One step at a time. Emily nodded. That's all I ask. The coffee machine beeped behind them, signaling the end of its cycle. But James barely noticed, because for the first time in what felt like forever, he had already taken the first step.